Hello y'all, this is RJ here at Point Lookout Confederate Park. This is here in Point Lookout, Maryland. This is where that infamous POW camp was. It was the largest POW camp of the war, America's history actually, where there's 52,000 Southern Americans, Confederates who are imprisoned here. And thousands upon thousands are buried just beyond here. I'm going to go walk over there in just a moment to the Confederate cemetery. But first I want to share with you this memorial right here. This is the newest Confederate memorial in the world, just dedicated, unveiled just a few hours ago. Beautiful. It was a wonderful ceremony right here. If you haven't had a chance, I encourage you to come out here. This is one of the more, I would consider one of the more remote Confederate memorial parks. After all, it is right here in one of the fingers of Maryland, right on the far, far eastern side of Maryland. This is just about 10 miles south of St. Mary's, which is the earliest first capital of Maryland. Dates back to 1600s. This is really super close to where the Potomac River converges with the Chesapeake Bay. In fact, the Chesapeake Bay is beyond, not too far beyond these trees out here, and the Potomac River is down this way. If you keep on going down this road here, you eventually get to the end of the road, the end of the line, where the Potomac River converges with the Chesapeake Bay, and there's a lighthouse out there. It was a wonderful ceremony that was just here just a little bit. People are starting to clean up and clear out, but I wanted to be able to share this with you. And then I'm going to walk over to the Confederate cemetery. I'm going to talk to you more about that because I just had a great talk with the folks who are here. We ended up talking till past 1:30 in the morning last night, so I wanted to share some of the things we discussed with you. I'm really appreciative of basically the descendants of survivors or descendants of those who are buried here, the POW, of those who served or were imprisoned here in this camp. Thankfully, this memorial park was made possible by them. So first I want to share with you this new monument, this new memorial right here. It says, Maryland remembers with honor the valor and devotion of more than 22,000 sons who served in the Confederate States of America, Army, Navy, and Marine Corps. They served in the Maryland line as well as other units across the Confederacy. Maryland units include the 1st and 2nd Maryland Infantry, the 1st and 2nd Maryland Cavalry, 1st Immense Battery, and so forth. Also remembered is the sacrifice of countless civilian men, women, and children who supported the war effort by acting as guides to couriers, medical personnel, blockade runners, and spies. You can see some other commentary here. It is worth mentioning that that's one of the unique aspects of this. As you know, Lincoln suspended habeas corpus, and he was very willing to arrest people who opposed him, or willing to arrest folks civilians, non-combatants, who were potentially Southern sympathizers, and there are civilians who are actually imprisoned here as well. Here's that famous text from Maryland, Maryland. Now this is a very historic place because after all this was a POW camp. There was 52,000 that were buried here. That's more than Andersonville or any other place, and they say the conditions are just as bad as Andersonville. The difference was the North Union was able to take care of them. They could have provided us more supplies, better food, better accommodations, but no, they didn't do that. They only gave these men maybe, as I believe, one blanket for 3 men, kept them exposed. There was no hardened buildings at all, and they were all exposed to the elements, given terrible diets. There's a very high mortality rate of those who died here at Point Lookout Prison. But you can read this right here. This memorial plaza is to honor the sacrifice of the 52,264 Confederate soldiers, sailors, and civilians imprisoned near here during the war between the states. Point Lookout Prison Camp was established immediately following the Battle of Gettysburg and was operated by the Union Army from September 1863 to June 1865. The camp was built to hold 10,000 prisoners. At times, it held more than double that amount of military and civilians. Due to inhumane conditions as well as active persecution, thousands of prisoners died. The record is incomplete and is still being compiled. Even though there were funds to house and feed the prisoners adequately, they died of exposure to the elements, disease, starvation, and indiscriminate shootings. Colonel William Hoffman, Commissary General of Union prisoners, saved over $2 million allotted for the care of Confederate prisoners by denying prisoners enough food to prevent starvation. Point Lookout Prisoner of War Descendants Organization, the POW, was founded to honor the sacrifices of their ancestors as well as to bring to the public the true story of the inhumane treatment of prisoners at Point Lookout. In 2002, the Maryland State Park Service and U.S. Veterans Administration began to require all speeches and reenactments to be submitted for censoring, as well as other discriminatory actions directed at only Southern heritage organizations. The most unacceptable directive for descendants to accept was prohibiting the display of the Confederate flag over the mass graves of the thousands of men that fought and died under the Confederate banner. In 2003, POW, once again that's Point Lookout Prisoner of War Descendant Organization, purchased this land to erect a memorial plaza that would be free of government interference and restrictions. This memorial will list the hundreds and perhaps thousands of additional documented names of those that died that are not listed on the monument at the adjacent federal cemetery. It says, there's a quote here by Reverend James Smith, the last survivor of the staff of Lieutenant General Thomas Stonewall Jackson. All that was, or is now, desired that the truth be told without exaggeration and without omission, truth for its honest own sake and for the sake of honest history. That's why it's great to be a Southern sympathizer, because after all, the truth is on your side. All we care about is the full, accurate history be retold. This is the flags of the Confederate Memorial Park, and you can see some of them right here, which includes, you see the Bonnie Blue, you see the First National, you see the Second National, Third National, the Cherokee Confederation flag, you see the St. Andrew's Cross, and others. All the state flags as well. A little bit of a display right here. I'm going to walk over to the Confederate Cemetery in just a moment. I'm sharing this partly so I can remember more of the history about this place. I like to take videos of places I like to listen to, videos I like to watch later. As you see here, this historical sign. This historical sign says, Point Lookout Prisoner of War Camp. After the Battle of Gettysburg, the Union established a prisoner of war depot near here. Confederate soldiers and Maryland civilians were imprisoned and guarded by 400 Union troops, with only tents for protection. 3,384 prisoners died. Now that is an extremely low ball. That's the bare minimum. Many estimate that there were easily double that are buried right over here. Some estimates are as high as 14,000 that are buried over here. I'm gonna walk over there in just a little bit. Right here, this speaks about the U.S. government located in Washington, D.C. was surrounded by Maryland and Virginia. Since Virginia had already joined the Confederacy, it was critical to the survival of the Union and that Maryland not be allowed to secede. The state was quickly occupied by Union forces, and her secessionist legislators were thrown into jail before they could vote for secession. Isn't that amazing? I've been over to that place, Kemp Hall over there in Frederick, Maryland, where the legislature had disbanded from Annapolis and were traveling over there, and Lincoln rounded up and ordered the arrest of all those legislators that potentially opposed his vote. speaks about that right here. It says, once again, the state was quickly occupied by Union forces, and her secessionist legislators were thrown into jail before they could vote for secession. Of the 92,000 votes cast by Maryland in the 1860 presidential election, fewer than 3,000 were for Lincoln. However, approximately half of the population were against secession, but strongly for Southern rights. You can read more about that right here. This is an interesting history with this particular historical marker. This historical marker, as I remember, used to be located just down this road, and suddenly it came up missing. It was missing for years, and there was another attempt to try to have another one built. And inadvertently at some flea market later on, somebody ran across this. Somebody was trying to make money off this or trying to sell this sign for a couple $1,000s. They knew it had been stolen. They knew it was illegal to sell that. They contacted the sheriff. The police got involved, arrested those folks. They recovered it and they brought it here. In the meantime, they had actually created another memorial historical marker that's just down this road. So now there's two historical markers. So, interesting story in history. So, in other words, watch your historical markers. Because I am finding historical markers missing, because we all know the leftist, the Mayo, what I call the Mayoist, are all about censorship. They don't want anybody to, they want to keep the people as ignorant as possible. So it's no surprise that when there was an actual museum, an accurate historical museum that was destroyed earlier this year over at Fort Branch, it's amazing how many hateful leftist trolls came out and were thrilled and cheering that a museum was actually destroyed. It was unbelievable. It's amazing how many people were thrilled that a museum, an actual historically accurate museum, was destroyed. It wasn't pro-South, it was just telling you the history of the place. Now here, this marker right here used to be located over there at Silver Springs, Maryland. I saw it before it was removed. And basically this was, during the siege of Petersburg, Robert E. Lee had sent Ewell Early up there to relieve the pressure and to try to divert Union troops away from the siege over at Petersburg, because as you know, Petersburg was under siege for over 9 months. And Robert Lee sent him up there, and there was the Battle of Monocacy that took place in Maryland. And as you know, Ewell Early and his troops came across and confronted Washington, D.C. They got to the outer forces, the outer defenses of Washington, D.C., and they were engaged there. Well, there was at least 17 Confederate soldiers that were killed or died during that period of time, and they were buried over there at the church building that's over there in Silver Springs. Well, that's where they were for all those years. And I remember going to visit this monument and memorial when I was over there. But during this so-called Summer of Love, we all know the Summer of Hate, the Bolshevik movement in 2020, the leftists came and they toppled this monument. And it just shows you kind of the type of people that they are. That they actually toppled a memorial. This was in a cemetery, a graveyard attached to a church building. All it was is to the memory of 17 unknown Confederate dead. And so it was toppled. And it was relocated right here. And you can read that right here. It says, to the memory of 17 unknown Confederate dead who fell in front of Washington, D.C., July 12, 1864, by their comrades. I'm going to read some of this because it used to be by Grace Church. And I was just amazed that the people stoop so low to actually remove and topple a monument, a memorial to those who fought in the war in a graveyard. But that's the leftist for you, right? So it speaks a little bit about it right here. It says, this monument was originally at the Grace Church Cemetery at the corner of Grace Church Road and Georgia Avenue in Silver Springs, Maryland. It was rededicated at Confederate Memorial Park on October 9th, 2020. Until its relocation to Confederate Memorial Park, the monument marked the final resting place of 17 Confederate soldiers who fell during General Ewell Early's attack on Fort Stevens, Washington, D.C., about 3 miles south of the Grace Church Cemetery. The 17 soldiers were initially buried where they fell, on the Osborne Farm. 10 10 years after they fell, Reverend James Everett, the pastor of Grace Church and a Confederate veteran, led an effort to disinter and rebury them in front of his church. On December 11, 1874, the 17 bodies in 6 plain coffins were reinterred in a cemetery attended by about 300 people. Dr. Alexander Garnett, who had been Jefferson Davis's physician during the war, gave an hour-long oration justifying secession and praising the willingness of the South to take up arms, to defend their homes from invasion. That's exactly what it was all about. They were there to defend their homes from invasion. In 1896, when a trolley line was to be built near the graves, the Confederate Veterans Camp in Washington, D.C. and Rockville, Maryland, jointly decided to move the graves to the corner of the church's cemetery and to erect a monument. Money was raised, the graves were moved, and the monument was dedicated on November 14, 1896. So this dates back to 1896. The cemetery included readings of Robert E. Lee's General Order 9, his farewell address to the Army of Northern Virginia, and an oration by Judge Samuel Blackwell, the third auditor of the U.S. Treasury and a former colonel in the Confederate Army. Among other things, he said that both North and South alike should now stand for the perpetuation of patriotism and the flag. At the conclusion of the oration, Paul Jones, whose father had died fighting for the Union, said that a member of the Loyal Legion, the Union's Officers Veterans Association, he claimed the privilege of recognizing the valor of the Confederate soldiers by laying at the foot of the monument a large bunch of white chrysanthemums. So once again, this is the monument for the 17 dead that used to be there in Silver Springs, Maryland, right on the edge of the Washington, D.C. line. I remember seeing it a couple times before removed. I've shared photos of it on Dixie Forever. It was toppled. The church got rid of it. It was relocated here, so thankfully I appreciate that. But I am kind of disgusted in some other aspects because the church replaced it, the head marker, they replaced this marker with a simple, flat, ground level marker that was just generic. Just basically says, I think it says just 17 soldiers from the Civil War. I think that's all it says. There's no indication they're Confederate soldiers, no other indication. There's just a flat marker that lays on the ground there now. So I'll share another photo of that sometime, before and after photos of this marker. They should have just kept it there, but I'm sure they had their reasons. Now you can see off in the distance, so first off, right over here, they are trying to rebuild kind of what the POW camp wall kind of looked like to a point. Now this is all pretty new. They had built this in just the last year or 2 years. In fact, they originally placed the boards, they initially had cut the boards about a year and let the boards sit for about a year to let them kind of cure, straighten out, and placed it here. So this reminds me a little bit about like what they did at Andersonville. If you go to Andersonville, you can see a portion of the POW camp that was rebuilt, not rebuilt, but recreation of it. And so that's what they've done. This is all pretty new, just been here about a year or so. You can see some of the other POW kind of camping items along the side, like a little fire pit. In fact, some of those from D.P. Newton's Civil War Museum that used to be on the outskirts of Fredericksburg, across from White Oak Primitive Church. You can see some of the relics from there. And you can, so this is all new. And also in the background is a new cemetery. Now, this cemetery in the background, basically what happened, there was originally like 3 or 4 Confederate cemeteries around here. And around 1872, 1873 or so, they were consolidated. There was reinterments, and they placed them all in 2 cemeteries. And then later on, they reburied them over here in the Confederate cemetery that I'm going to go to real soon. Well, there was one cemetery that by all indications was not reinterred. It was untouched. There was a cemetery, and when they rebuilt this road that goes right out along here, they rerouted the road to go a little bit more right through the cemetery. Well, the folks here, they had all the plots and the plans, and they knew they were rerouting this road just a little bit down this road here. They were rerouting it right through the cemetery. And they were outraged, but the government wasn't helping too much. And so they actually tracked the dump trucks where they had picked up that soil, the soil from all the excavation from the cemetery, and they watched where those trucks went. The trucks went about 22 miles up the road. They found out exactly where they were dumping them in a fill, and they were able to work with the people there to actually scoop that dirt back up that contained the remains of the Confederate soldiers and put them here in this mound right across from here. So that's what that's all about, is a new cemetery. That's why this is kind of a hallowed grounds too. That is actually the remains that the excavation from the cemetery where the road was placed. That's just up the road here. So that's all new. The fence is new. The fence has only been here about a year or so. They're still trying to pay that off. It costs several $1,000s, of course, to build a fence like that. The Children of Confederacy are helping out with that particular project. Appreciate them doing that. Now, it's worth mentioning also that this park started out with just basically about roughly 2-ish acres. It was about 1.5 acres. It was really closer to, it was over 2 acres. This spot right here, this land right here is part of the Confederate Confederate Memorial Park. And then later they acquired this land right over here, another like 5 acres. This land that's right over here. So all this land was more recent acquisition right through this area. And they were able to pay for that largely when they had to, they were doing some extending the road out there, and the government actually reimbursed them for some of the road, for some of the easement out here. So they're able to get, and so the actual money they received from that could be used to help pay off that, fully pay for the extra 5 acres. Now we're going to walk over here because this land, they have their eyes set on this land, and how awesome would it be if they could acquire this land over here, because this is the land between here and the Confederate Cemetery. There's this piece of property that would be so great to acquire. How awesome would it be if they could extend this, have this Confederate Memorial Park go right to the edge of the Confederate Cemetery. Now I'm just doing a quick perusal through here. If you ever walk through here, this statue on top here, this statue was actually made possible by Gary Castile, who actually spoke today. He's the one who has a store. He's been doing monuments and statues. He's been an artisan, basically a sculptor his whole life. He was raised in West Virginia, got away from the coal mining business with his family, and he sculpted this. So this is a unique, one-of-a-kind Confederate statue that's up on top of here. There's none other like it. So that was made possible by Gary Castile. Gary Castile is known for, he's made quite a few statues. One of them is the James Longstreet, that's there on Gettysburg. If you always go see the Longstreet equestrian statue, he's the same sculptor who made the sculpture on top. Along here, there's comments, voices from the pen, letters from Confederate soldiers who are here. All these are heart-wrenching. I love to share this kind of stuff. So just all around the side, you can read about the Confederate soldiers. Here's the statue. This is where we just had the unveiling dedication ceremony that was just right here just a little bit ago. Here is some of the Point Lookout camp. We're just a little bit outside from where we're at. The camp was actually, the actual POW camp was just down this road a little bit further. We are actually a little north of there, so we're a little outside the scene. Erected by the Point Lookout POW Descendants Organization. This is erected back in 2008, dedicated to the memory of Confederate POWs, military and civilian men and women and children who were incarcerated in Point Lookout prison camp. Now, I didn't notice that it does include men, women, and children who are here. It wasn't just soldiers. There were children expected to be buried here as well. mostly from the families of the guards, because as you know, there was at least 400 guards here, and their mortality rate was also very high, and they brought their families, and their children died here as well. So they believe there are children also buried here. It's a beautiful park. This improves a little bit every time I come here. Now I'm going to start walking towards the Confederate cemetery. Talk more about that in just a little bit. So this is the Confederate Memorial Park. I'm sharing this with you because I know it's this is tough to get to. This is kind of a remote place. It's right on the edge, like I said, on the far edge of the state of Maryland, on one of the fingers. This is not a through road. If you follow this road down there, all it does is come to a dead end where you eventually get to Point Lookout State Park and then eventually the lighthouse. But this is part of the Confederate Memorial Park. Once again, made possible by the Point Lookout POW Descendants Organization. They do such a wonderful job here with all the flags, the maintenance. This is a huge undertaking to do this. They recognize some of the folks who come here regularly and help maintain this. So many good folks who come out here and devote their time and effort and to make this possible. So I encourage you to help support, donate, volunteer as much as you can. I would say I love all the Confederate memorial parks. This one is, of course, uniquely very historic because after all, it's right there beside the largest mass burial for Confederates in the world, and also right at the largest POW camp. So I'm going to walk over there right now. Before I do so, as I travel around, I love to see the good things the SCV is doing. Like for example, right here, you see the SCV camp here has adopted this highway. The Captain Vince Camp, Sons of Confederate Veterans. Thank you for doing that. I'm gonna start walking this way. So you can see, here's the Confederate Park, Confederate Memorial Park right over here. And now this is that piece of land they're trying to acquire, eventually would like to acquire. Now they're the first up for being able to acquire it. But how awesome would it be if you can extend this memorial park right up to the edge of the Confederate cemetery. The whole reason, one of the reasons this whole existed is because when the government started becoming woke, they used to have memorial services out here. They used to have historically accurate flags. But like I said, right around 2002, the woke government started to prevent that, starting to prevent them from actually bringing Southern flags in here, only targeting Southerners. Also, you got some traffic going through here. But here is the Confederate Memorial. I'm sorry, the Confederate Cemetery. So it's worth mentioning. Now this obelisk right here, this large, tall obelisk, 85 feet tall. This was dedicated back in 1911. Well, it was placed here in 1910, dedicated about 1911. But this is actually, right here is the first memorial, the first obelisk. This one dates back to 1876. This has been actually moved 3 times. This memorial right here, basically the history of this place is they originally reinterred Confederates to this area, and they had placed that obelisk here back in the 1870s, and it was here for a number of years, decades, and then it was moved over to the actual Confederate cemetery that's just down this road, and that's where it was until I think it was the 1830s, and then they moved it back here in the 1830s. So you see here, this is maintained by, it's a federal prison, I'm sorry, no, a federal cemetery. And you can see the Veterans Administration, 1930. And this is part of the Point Lookout Confederate Cemetery. Now, I was just looking at the books last night. As many books, there's a lot of books that are missing, unfortunately. This place was kind of sketchy because this place in many ways was just as brutal, just as bad as Andersonville was. But we have photos of Andersonville. We know how hellish it was. We know it was absolutely awful and just a hellish place. Well, there was photos of this place too, which clearly showed this place was also a hellish POW camp. And the photographer, after the war, claims that somebody broke into his house and somebody stole those lithographs, those photographs, the only photographs they had of this POW camp. He says, and that's the only thing they stole. They just took that and they left. How suspicious is that? That suddenly the photographic evidence of this POW camp was gone. You might see over here, you see the Confederate flag is flying off here in the background. And that's what we're trying to do, is trying to acquire this property all around. There's this one piece of property that goes all the way around the backside. If they can acquire that, it would be awesome to be able to have an extension of the Confederate Memorial Park around this Confederate cemetery. Now originally there used to be 3 or 4 Confederate cemeteries around here with thousands, usually over 1,000 burials per cemetery. And each of them, most of them had wooden planks for grave markers. And unfortunately, right about 1870, just a few years later after the war, a fire came through and burned all of those wooden head markers, which included all their identities. All the identities, the location of all the burials were lost at that point. And the cattle came through there, and there was erosion because, after all, we're right between the Potomac River, we're right between the Chesapeake Bay, all the erosion, and plus there's a very high water table here. That's one of the reasons that led to a high death rate and a very high rate of disease and sickness, because we're only about 3, 4, 5 feet above the water table right now. We're only about 3 feet above the water, the nearby rivers. And in fact, ocean, we're just a few feet above the ocean level out here. But they say that's led to all that. It's just terrible. The land and the is just awful around here. Well, so what they did is when all those markers burned, and all the erosion and all the remains started to pop up through the dirt because they're all buried in shallow graves with just a little bit of a dirt over the top. All the graves started becoming exposed just a few years after the war. And that's when they got two black men to reinter them. They were paid by the body to basically reinter those. And then they moved them to, they collected all the remains as much as possible, reinterred those to some cemeteries, and then not long after that, they reinterred them. Basically, they opened up a big gap right here below this obelisk here, and they placed the remains of 10 bodies per box. It was like a big vault. And they placed thousands of bodies right underneath this obelisk right here. And then they placed that monument over here in 1876, right on top of it. Well, of course, they're not going to capture everything. And it's clear, it looks like they did not even excavate or not even reinter for an entire cemetery. But at the same time, they lost the identity of where the individual graves were, but thankfully they had some records. And that's what they have here. They did inscribe the names or list the names of those who they believe died here. And it includes the over 3,000. This monument right here was once again dedicated back about 1911, and it was erected by the United States. So this was a memorial that was dedicated by the United States. It reminds you, it's similar to other POW camps. If you go to the other POW camps around the country, like Finn Point or the one in Chicago, or they're all quite a few others around, you will see some others that are like this too, where the graves are unmarked. There are no individual gravestones anywhere, but there is a listing of names. At least these, in this case, 3,400. And so if I zoom in on this, you can see how it says, erected by the United States to mark the burial place of Confederate soldiers and sailors who died at Point Lookout, Maryland, while prisoners of war, and were there buried to the number of 3,384, but whose remains were subsequently removed, either to the respective homes or to the cemetery where the individual graves cannot be identified. So they cannot identify these graves now. Of course, way past that. But there's several others like that. For example, I went to one in Pittsburgh. It wasn't Pittsburgh, it was Pennsylvania, Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, and it's a terrible area of town, but there's a memorial, modest memorial, and they have markers like this listing the names of those who they believe are buried here. So you look on all four sides, and here are the names of the roughly 3,300 Confederate soldiers that are buried right here in this, underneath, right at the base of this memorial right here. Good chance that you have a family member, a descendant, and if you do, hey, you belong in this organization that's right here beside us. The ones who honor the relatives, the ancestors, those family members who died here, who were imprisoned here and died here. So if you have a family member or relative, please come out here and support the Point Lookout Descendants organization that founded this Confederate Memorial Park right on the other side of these trees. So you can see on all four sides are the names, 3,300 names. Now, many say, once again, that this is the lowball estimate. It's more likely 6,000, 7,000, estimates as high as 14,000 that are actually buried here. In fact, they were unclear about the number even back early, because if we go look at the first Confederate memorial, this one right here, that was erected back in the sesquicentennial, 1876. This one, it lists 3,400. And what I like what they've done here is they actually have listed the number they believe from each state at the time. So sharing this with you, it says, erected by the state of Maryland in memory of the Confederate soldiers who died prisoners of war at Point Lookout from March 1st, 1864 to March 30th, 1865. Colonel William Elliott, General William Oates, and Governor James Berry. And that's something else. If you recognize General Oates, that's mentioned right here, he was the colonel of the 15th Alabama who led that famous charge up Little Round Top at Gettysburg. He was with his brother at the time. They had just finished an over 20-mile march in a hot summer day with very little food, very little water, with all that wool, carrying all that gear. 20 miles, many of them didn't have any shoes or anything, only to arrive on the battlefield and be asked to go charge the hill. It's amazing that what they were able to try to accomplish that day at Gettysburg. Anyway, General Oates ended up becoming governor of Alabama. He's buried there in Montgomery, Alabama. I've been to his gravesite many times because I used to live in Montgomery. He lost his arm during the war and everything else. But here's what I was mentioning earlier, where it has listed the numbers from different states of those who believe buried here, and includes the 3,400, right, as you see right here, they believed at the time. Now, the records are very sketchy, because like I said, they didn't reinter potentially entire different cemetery. By the time they built this one, they had reinterred 3,300, but I was just looking at the records just last night. We were talking until 1:30 in the morning, and there are a lot of names of burials that are not listed here. A lot of names. So that's why they say when they created these bronze or these plaques down here with the names, it's missing a lot of names of those who are buried here. If you really want the complete, if you want to check to see if your family member, your ancestor is buried here, don't just rely only on this. There are other records you'll have to go check. And they've got the most complete listing of names over here at the descendants of POW, of the Point Lookout descendants. So the whole reason, once again, that organization was formed because they used to have respectful memorial services to honor those who lived here. But incredibly, the federal government decided to not allow them to have their services here anymore and not to have their flags here anymore. And that's when they said, okay, forget it. We'll just go create a Confederate Memorial Park right over here. I'm so glad they did that. I'm so glad that the owner of this property understands the history of this place, the historic place. He understands these historic grounds. And these people deserve to have a historically accurate, respectful flag. And I'm so glad there is a Army of Northern Virginia American flag that's right here. Right here on the edge of the park. Hang on a second, it's starting to rain. Let me get my umbrella out for a moment. I wasn't expecting this rain. Thankfully, the rain held off. The rain held off very well through the entire service today. Once again, it's nice to see the flag right there. Wouldn't it be so great if there was flags all on the outskirts, if the descendants were able to acquire this land? This deserves to be here. It's just outrageous that these flags and the people who honored them and were most respectful were chased off this property. But if you can imagine, so I want to also mention, so there was, hang on a second, gotta change the battery here. It's worth mentioning that originally, all those original numbers that were buried right here, they were placed here before this obelisk was placed here in 1910, 1911. But later on, when they were doing excavation along the road, they excavated another cemetery and they opened up this ground right here and they buried more right through here in this area. So you wouldn't know it, but there are, I'm respectfully walking on these hallowed grounds right over hundreds, if not thousands of others. That's something they usually don't mention on these historical markers over here. Now I'm gonna go read this historical marker over here, get ready to finish this up, because after all, we're going on, it's over 40 minutes. But once again, I know this place is out of the way. This is a very special Confederate Memorial Park. I've been to most of the Confederate Memorial Parks, pretty much all of them in the country. There's one in Alabama I used to go to a lot. Of course, Stone Mountain, we know in Georgia. Of course, we know about Valor Park over there in North Carolina, and there's New Bern has one, and Lee Jackson Park over in Virginia. And there's Missouri. It's got a nice park, and I know I'm missing some. But this is the one from Maryland, and it happens to be right beside this famous POW camp. But reading this right here, this actually used to be it's called Point Lookout Confederate Cemetery. But it actually used to be called Camp Hoffman Prison. And it says it right here. The Union prison at Camp Hoffman, Maryland, called Point Lookout, opened in 1863. A 15-foot high plank fence surrounded the 40-acre prison compound. The first prisoners arrived in July 1863. Confederates captured the Battle of Gettysburg. By the year's end, the population reached 9,000. All prisoners lived in tents, including the sick, When the war ended in April 1865, the prison housed 22,000 men. So once again, the prison that was here at Point Lookout was designed for only 10,000. It ended up housing more than double that. And they all lived in tents, regardless if you're sick or not. The Confederate dead. Between July 1863 and June 1865, when it closed, more than 52,000 prisoners had been held at Point Lookout. More than 3,000 died and were interred in 3 prison cemeteries. All graves were marked with wooden headboards. After the war, some bodies were removed from their cemeteries at Point Lookout. However, no record was made of who was removed. It's one of the mysteries. The records are very incomplete. One unauthorized business removed bodies at the request of a friend or family for a fee. So those 2 people I was talking about earlier on, or for a fee, they can reinter their family members. In 1867, the War Department purchased the land containing the Union and Confederate cemeteries. Soon, the U.S. Army moved Union remains to Arlington National Cemetery. So once again, there were a lot of Union guards that died here as well as expected, and they were moved to Arlington National Cemetery. Confederate remains at Point Lookout were marked with new headboards. 3 years later, the state of Maryland purchased this ground and moved 3,400 Confederate dead and the federally owned cemeteries to this site. In 1876, Maryland erected a modest marble obelisk to mark the graves, and that's the obelisk we just looked at right here. That has been, like I said, it was originally located right here, and then it was moved to the cemetery that was down the road, and then later on, it was brought back here. The Commission for Marking Graves of Confederate Dead began documenting interments at Point Lookout in 1906. So, years, we're talking about over 40 years later. It wasn't until over 40 years later they began documenting interments. After the commissioner determined that the graves could not be marked individually, he received permission to erect a single monument. So once again, all those markers, those headstones, those wooden markers had been burned and destroyed. Nothing remained. Maryland deeded this cemetery to the federal government in 1910. The Van Army Granite Company of Boston, Massachusetts, finished the 85-foot tall obelisk. The following year, bronze plaques on the monument base and the mound supporting it contained the names of 3,384 Confederate soldiers and sailors. 44 civilians identified by the commission are buried at the site and not listed. So once again, civilians, remember, civilians like Francis Scott Key's own grandson, who was considered potentially a son of sympathizers. Union forces arrived at his home at night and drug him out of his own home. Can you imagine that happening today? Just because he was potentially a sympathizer. Can you imagine the president doing that today? It's kind of like what's happening in Britain almost, right? They're arresting people just because of their opinions. That's exactly how the left, that's why many people say the Marxist movement really, the Union was really a continuation of the Marxist movement. But as it says here, the exact number of individuals who died at the site in prison and are buried here may never be determined. But once again, that is soldiers and civilians that are buried here. And this was created towards reconciliation, as it says. On May 30th, 1868, the Grand Army Republic decorated Union and Confederate graves at Arlington. So once again, what has happened to America today? Even there, just a few years after the war, even former decorated Union soldiers recognized Confederate veterans and decorated their graves and insisted they be honored as well. You kind of wonder what's happened today in today's narrow-minded, shallow society. It says 30 years later, President William McKinley proclaimed, "The Union is once more the common altar of our love and loyalty, our devotion and sacrifice. Every soldier's grave made during our unfortunate Civil War is a tribute to American valor. In the spirit of fraternity, we should share with you in the care of the graves of the Confederate soldiers." So once again, this is from the President of the United States, who was a decorated Union soldier who fought on the battlefield. He was shot at by Confederate soldiers, and he said, "We should share with you in the care of the graves of the Confederate soldiers." So what's it mean in today when former Union soldiers were the ones who were actually the impetus, who actually were the ones who helped provide, or the key spearheaded the efforts to create Confederate monuments in many cases, like this one, like the one in Arlington National Cemetery, right? The one in Arlington National Cemetery, built in the spirit of reconciliation, made possible by former Union veterans. Former Union veterans spoke a lot at the dedication ceremonies, and yet this generation ended up removing the Confederate Memorial, the Reconciliation Memorial. So what message did that send? Do we have any more reconciliation? These were built in the spirit of reconciliation. They were built in the spirit of fraternity, in the spirit of respect, spirit of unity. Does that mean that that concept is done? It's gone? There's no more reconciliation? Is that what that means? It says, 4 former Confederate officers headed by the commission over a lifetime. So once again, the War Department created the Confederate section Arlington in 1901 and marked the graves with distinct pointed top marble headstones. 5 years later, the Congress created the Commission for Marking Graves of Confederate Dead to identify and mark the graves of Confederates who died in northern prisons. Its mission was later expanded to encompass all national cemeteries that contain Confederate burials. There are a lot of national cemeteries that have Confederate burials because after all, Confederate soldiers were recognized as American. They were American and they were recognized as American veterans as well. 4 former Confederate officers headed the commission over its lifetime. By 1916, it had marked in excess of 25,000 graves and erected monuments in locations where individual graves could not be identified. In 1930, the War Department authorized the addition of the Southern Cross of Honor to the Confederate headstone. So certainly these Confederate headstones deserve the Southern Cross of Honor, made possible by former Union soldiers themselves. And one of those who led, once again, this entire commission for these war cemeteries, 4 more actually former Confederate veterans as well. And it's to be mentioned, one of those was the Oates, who was commander of the Alabama 15th Regiment, who attacked, who went up Little Round Top against Joshua Chamberlain that day in Gettysburg. He was seriously wounded. His brother was killed. He saw his brother for the last time. His brother had been shot 8 times, he said, at Gettysburg. And he went back to find his brother. He could never find the remains of his brother. And even though Colonel Oates became Governor Oates, General Oates and Governor Oates, even though he led the commission for cemeteries for those in the war, he didn't even know where the remains of his own brother were, because the memorials are so important. All right, I'm going to go ahead and transition over here. So once again, this place, hallowed grounds, here in this usually pretty quiet area here in Point Lookout. So I'm going to go ahead and finish this up right now. So once again, right on the edge of Confederate Memorial Park, right here on these hallowed grounds. So take care, y'all. From Point Lookout, POW camp, Confederate Cemetery, and Confederate Memorial Park, encourage you to come out here, support, help as much as you can. These wonderful organizations. Pay your respects. Come out here when you have a chance. It's just down the road, about 10 miles south of St. Mary's, the earliest and first capital of Maryland. Close to the end, beautiful location. We got a lighthouse just down this road as well. So I hope you're all doing well. Take care, y'all, from Point Lookout, Maryland.